Picture this. It's February 3rd.
Okay.
And France's top diplomato operative is sitting down in this highly secure room in Moscow.
Right.
And he looks across the table at Vladimir Putin's senior foreign policy advisor, and he demands that Europe be guaranteed a seat at the table for any future peace negotiations regarding Ukraine.
A pretty bold move.
Right. And the Russian advisor just looks back at him and says, quote, "I'm sorry, but in fact, no, we don't have it. Go to hell."
Wow. Yeah, just right to his face.
Just boom. So, welcome to this deep dive, because today we are taking you inside the total collapse of the backdoor channels that are, we're attempting to manage the largest land war in Europe since World War II.
Yeah, and we're examining this massive geopolitical domino effect that basically proves local security doesn't really exist anymore.
Right.
We are going to look at how a sudden violent crisis all the way over in the Middle East has, actively paralyzed the only viable path to a ceasefire in Eastern Europe.
And we have a really fascinating stack of reporting to guide us through this today. We're pulling from these deep source investigations by the Financial Times and Le Monde, and we've cross-referenced those with some really detailed diplomatic tracking from Bloomberg and the Moscow Times.
See, we've got a lot of angles on this.
Exactly. And the mission for you, the listener, is to really unpack these secret meetings, these brutal rejections, and just the mechanical reality of how modern statecraft actually functions, when that polished veneer of public diplomacy completely shatters.
When the gloves come off.
Yes. So, okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the timeline of that February 3rd meeting. Because, the level of secrecy surrounding it tells us a lot about just how fragile this whole situation is.
It really does. The secrecy is honestly the most crucial context here. Because, public diplomacy...
The press conferences, the speeches at the UN, all that.
Right, exactly. All of that is largely theater.
Yeah.
The actual architecture of international relations is built in these backdoor channels. These secret channels exist precisely so that states can explore, frankly, unacceptable compromises.
Well, it's unacceptable to their own people, you mean?
Exactly. They can do it without the pressure of their domestic populations watching their every move. They're designed to be these, safe spaces for really hard, ugly truths.
Which makes the setup for this specific meeting so striking. So, according to the reporting, Emmanuel Bon, who is the head of French President Emmanuel Macron's diplomatic team, he travels to Moscow to meet with Yuri Ushakov.
Putin's foreign policy advisor.
Right, and this was the absolute first high-level French visit to the Kremlin since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022.
Which is a huge deal. That is 2 whole years of complete diplomatic deep freeze between Paris and Moscow.
2 years. And Le Monde actually described the arrangement for this meeting as being handled with, quote, utmost discretion.
Meaning nobody was supposed to know.
No, exactly. The Élysée Palace and the Kremlin both categorically refused to even confirm or deny that the trip happened at all.
And see, when you have a total information blackout like that, the stakes are just existential for the diplomats involved.
Right.
Bon wasn't there for a routine check-in. He was there to try and establish a baseline for how a post-war Europe might actually function.
But that baseline he tried to establish, it hit a brick wall. So a senior European diplomat actually leaked the details of this exchange to the Financial Times.
Okay.
So Bon argues that European states fundamentally deserve a role in shaping any future peace agreement.
Sure.
And then Ushakov delivers that incredibly explicit insult, telling him to essentially get out of the room and go to hell.
Yeah. Just brutal.
It is. And I really want to look at the mechanics of that response because, in high-stakes statecraft, using profanity at that level, it isn't just someone losing their temper, is it? It feels like a very calculated signal.
Oh, absolutely. It's a structural message about leverage.
Okay, how so?
Well, by using that specific, highly dismissive language, Ushakov isn't just saying no to Bon's proposal. He is rejecting the entire premise that France...
So the EU, basically.
Right, and by extension, the EU has any standing to even make a demand in the first place.
Wow.
It is Moscow communicating very clearly that they do not view Europe as an independent geopolitical pole that's capable of shaping the outcome of this conflict.
Which, okay, that brings up a strategic contradiction that I kind of have to push back on here.
Sure. What's that?
Because if you look at the leverage dynamics, why on earth would France risk the immense political embarrassment of sending their top guy to Moscow, secretly or not, if they weren't absolutely certain they had the leverage to force the door open?
A fair question.
Right. It reminds me of a corporate hostile takeover. Imagine you hold this tiny fraction of minority shares in a company, right?
Okay.
But you march right into the boardroom and demand voting rights on the executive committee.
Mm-hmm.
The majority shareholders aren't just going to say no. They're going to literally laugh you out of the building.
Right, they have all the power.
Exactly. Did Paris really miscalculate their own influence that badly?
Well, to really understand the French strategy here, you have to look at the exact message that Bonn was carrying.
Okay.
According to Bloomberg, and they were citing the Moscow Times on this, Bonn was sent to explicitly warn the Kremlin that Europe would not give its, quote, automatic nod to any peace agreement that was brokered without them.
An automatic nod. So basically saying, you can't just hand us a finished deal.
Exactly. And President Macron had actually already laid the groundwork for this publicly. He had been stating that Europeans needed to reestablish their own channels of dialogue. So the calculation in Paris wasn't necessarily that Putin would just, welcome them with open arms.
Right. They couldn't have been that naive.
The calculation was defensive.
Defensive against whom? Russia.
No, defensive against Washington and Moscow making a bilateral deal completely over Europe's head.
Oh, wow. I see.
Right. By putting this demand on the table, even in secret France, is attempting to legally and politically anchor Europe's right to be involved in decisions that affect the security architecture of its own continent.
That makes a lot of sense. But as my corporate takeover analogy highlights, just asserting you have a right to something doesn't magically generate the leverage you actually need to enforce it.
Bingo.
And Russia made it abundantly clear how they view Europe's leverage. I mean, before Bonn even got on the plane, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko had drawn this massive red line.
Right, I remember this.
He stated that EU involvement in peace talks was completely out of the question unless Europe halted all arms shipments to Kyiv.
Which is a huge demand.
Right. And then following that leaked February 3rd meeting, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov twisted the knife even further by publicly dismissing France's diplomatic overture as, quote, pathetic.
Yeah, and that exchange just completely reveals two entirely incompatible frameworks for how this war ends.
How do you mean?
Well, Europe believes it deserves a seat at the table inherently, right? By virtue of geography and historical precedent.
Because they live there.
Exactly. They share the continent, so they share the risk. Yeah. But Russia operates purely on transactional leverage.
Ah.
Moscow is effectively saying that access to the negotiating room is a commodity, and the price of admission to that room is abandoning military support for Ukraine.
But Grushko's demand to end arms shipments, that is a condition France and the broader EU would never accept.
Never.
It would mean total capitulation. So here's where it gets really interesting. If the price of admission is physically impossible for Europe to pay, was this whole French overture ultimately meant for Brussels rather than Moscow?
Posturing for their own neighbor.
Yeah. Was Macron trying to posture as the definitive leader of European security to his own allies, basically proving like, hey, France is the only power willing to do the dirty work of sitting across from someone like Ushakov?
That is a crucial nuance, because diplomacy frequently serves dual audiences.
Right.
The overture signals to the rest of Europe that Paris is actively trying to secure their collective future, even if it means taking a geopolitical black eye in Moscow.
But it also backfires, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Because it also exposes a really cynical reality about the current state of the continent.
Which is?
Europe is desperately trying to assert relevance in its own backyard, but the primary belligerent demands absolute concessions before even acknowledging they exist.
So France tries to muscle their way into the room, gets the door slammed in their face.
Exactly.
But the deep irony of this entire source stack we're looking at is that France was fighting tooth and nail for a seat at a table that doesn't actually exist right now.
Right. It's an empty room.
Because the only country with the leverage to actually build that table, the United States, just walked out of the building.
And that pivot right there brings us to the most sprawling, interconnected part of the intelligence we are analyzing today.
It's wild.
The failure of the French back channel is really just a symptom of a much larger collapse involving the U.S.-mediated trilateral talks.
Let's break down those talks, because the timeline here is basically a masterclass in global cause and effect.
It really is.
So the source material details that there was an active U.S.-mediated track meant to include Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. And they had actually been making progress.
Yes.
3 rounds of talks had already taken place this year in locations like Abu Dhabi and Geneva.
We should definitely pause on the significance of those locations, by the way.
Yeah.
Particularly Abu Dhabi.
Why is that?
Well, the fact that negotiations were being hosted in the United Arab Emirates shows that the traditional Western-dominated diplomatic scaffolding was already starting to shift.
That's a great point.
But regardless of the venue, these talks were the only active circuitry connecting Washington, Kiev, and Moscow.
Right. And the reports note that they produced, quote, limited results.
Which sounds bad, but
But in diplomacy, limited results often mean establishing the really vital operational parameters, like things like prisoner swap frameworks or grain corridor logistics.
exactly. It means the machinery of statecraft was functioning.
But that machinery was functioning right up until the end of February. And the cause of the collapse wasn't some disagreement over European borders. The cause was the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran that began on February 28th.
Right.
Within days of those strikes in the Middle East, the diplomatic circuitry in Eastern Europe completely shorted out.
Just shut down.
Yeah. By early March, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a public statement declaring that, quote, due to the situation with Iran, the necessary signals for a trilateral meeting have not yet arrived.
And the speed of that diplomatic contagion is just remarkable.
It's terrifying, honestly.
Because by March 12th, the freeze was absolute. Both Kyiv and Moscow publicly confirmed that scheduling any further rounds of talks was just impossible.
Yeah.
Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov actually went on the record to note that it was entirely unclear when U.S. officials would even be available to resume mediation.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Think about superpower mediation, like a central bank clearinghouse for geopolitical risks.
I like that analogy.
Right. When two warring nations want to explore a compromise, they don't just hand concessions directly to each other. The trust deficit is way too high.
They'd never risk it.
Exactly. So they deposit those concessions with a trusted, immensely powerful third party, the clearinghouse. And the United States was acting as that clearinghouse. But on February 28th, the central bank effectively locks its doors to deal with a massive fire in a completely different neighborhood.
Right.
And without the clearinghouse, the market for peace negotiations completely freezes. Neither Ukraine nor Russia can safely signal a compromise.
Your clearinghouse analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanical reality of what we call superpower bandwidth.
Superpower bandwidth. Unpack that for us.
So the United States obviously possesses vast military and economic resources.
Right.
But diplomatic attention at the executive level is finite.
There are only so many hours in a day.
Exactly. And when a volatile crisis erupts in the Middle East, especially one that involves direct military action with Iran, it just consumes all the strategic oxygen in Washington.
So everyone is focused on that.
Right. The lower-level deputies at the State Department might still be working on European portfolios, sure, but the primary decision-makers, the officials with the actual authority to underwrite a peace treaty,
they're suddenly absorbed by a completely different hemisphere.
Yeah.
And the fallout of that shifted attention, it immediately alters the reality for troops on the ground in Eastern Europe.
Real lives are impacted instantly.
Absolutely. The sources highlight deep concerns that Ukraine is just sliding down Washington's priority list. During a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, Senator Angus King issued this really stark assessment. He stated that because of this sudden pause in American mediation, quote, the clear winner is Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Which is a heavy statement.
It is. And I want to dig into the mechanics of that statement. Why does a paused meeting in Geneva physically advantage Russian forces on the front lines? Like, impartially speaking, how does that leverage work?
It comes down to how time functions as a weapon in a war of attrition. When U.S.-mediated talks freeze, the immediate diplomatic pressure on Russia to entertain a ceasefire just evaporates.
Because there's no one forcing them to the table.
Right. Without the looming threat of an impending U.S.-backed negotiation that might, say, freeze the front lines in place.
Right.
The Russian military command gains immense logistical flexibility.
Meaning they don't have to hedge their bets.
Precisely. They don't have to hold their reserves back just to strengthen a sudden negotiating position.
Oh, wow.
They can fully commit to offensive operations. And furthermore, a diplomatic freeze buys Moscow time to basically wait out the domestic funding cycles in Western capitals.
Right, wait for people to lose interest or run out of money.
Exactly. While the U.S. is completely distracted by Iran, Ukraine is simultaneously starved of both the diplomatic momentum needed to end the war.
And potentially the localized attention required to maintain their own supply lines.
Exactly. It shifts the entire strategic calculus. It grants Russia massive breathing room, while Kiev is left waiting for those necessary signals that simply cannot be transmitted right now.
It is just a sobering look at how fragile the entire international system is. I mean, we try to compartmentalize global events to make sense of them, right?
Major, yeah.
We put the Middle East in one conceptual box, and we put Eastern Europe in another box.
Right.
But February 28th proves that the compartments don't actually exist. Strikes in Iran on a Tuesday directly caused peace talks for a war thousands of miles away to die on a Thursday.
It's all connected.
They are all drawing from the exact same highly limited reservoir of international capital and superpower mediation.
And the realization here, if we connect this to the bigger picture, is that the global security architecture is just a single, tightly wound ecosystem.
Yeah.
A stress fracture in one region forces a structural load onto another. When the United States directs its bandwidth toward managing the fallout with Iran, it creates a vacuum in Europe.
A huge vacuum.
And as we saw with Emmanuel Bond's trip to Moscow, Europe currently lacks the standalone leverage to fill that vacuum themselves.
So let's pull all these threads together to look at the larger picture our sources have painted today.
Okay.
The diplomatic path to resolving the Ukraine conflict is facing a systemic paralysis.
Completely.
On one side, you have European powers, led by this French initiative, recognizing the danger and attempting to proactively secure a voice in their own continental security.
Right.
But their backdoor overtures are met with explicit hostility from a Kremlin that views them as entirely irrelevant to the final outcome.
Right. Go to hell.
Exactly, go to hell. And simultaneously, the one power the Kremlin does view as a peer, the United States, is forced to indefinitely suspend its mediation efforts because its strategic bandwidth has been totally consumed by the escalation in the Middle East.
So the established mechanisms for conflict resolution are basically offline.
Completely offline.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative question to mull over. We started this deep dive looking at the highly guarded doors of international diplomacy, and the shock is seeing Europe get aggressively locked out of the room by Russia.
Meanwhile, the United States is entirely preoccupied with putting out fires in the Middle East, leaving that negotiating table totally empty.
Right.
But nature abhors a vacuum. Earlier, we noted that the U.S.-mediated talks were previously making headway in Abu Dhabi, which is a clear sign that the center of diplomatic gravity is already shifting.
It signals that the traditional Western monopoly on conflict resolution is beginning to fracture.
Exactly. So the question you really have to ask yourself is this. If Europe is barred from the room, and the United States is too stretched to mediate, how long before that massive diplomatic vacuum forces a completely non-Western power to step in?
That's a fascinating thought.
Right. Are we rapidly approaching a reality where a nation completely outside the traditional Western alliance network sits down at the head of that table and dictates the terms of peace in Europe's own backyard?
Honestly, given the current paralysis in Washington and Paris, it is a scenario that moves closer to reality with every passing day of silence.
Definitely something to keep a close eye on as this interconnected chessboard continues to shift. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.